What's going on, everyone? It's Ben from YGO from Zero, back with another Critter format video. And in this video, to sort of wrap up my initial coverage of Critter format, I'm going to make a tier list of what I think are the main Critter format decks. Now, this tier list is very subject to change, as Critter is still being explored and it's gaining popularity. So as people explore it more and experiment more, different decks may rise up or fall depending on how the meta shifts, but this is how I view the meta right now in December of 2022. But before I dive into this tier list, let me first talk about what these tiers mean. Now, these tiers are generally used to talk about tournament representation, so, how many people are bringing a certain deck type, and, if it's above a certain percentage, it's tier 0 or tier 1 or etc. But given that there aren't as many major Critter tournaments as there are, tournaments for the present format of Yu-Gi-Oh!, we're going to go by this a bit differently. So tier 0 is a deck that's basically nigh unbeatable by pretty much any other deck in the format. It's a bit of a rare deck category, and not all formats will have a tier 0 deck. And I actually think Critter doesn't have a tier 0 deck. So there will be nothing in that slot for this tier list. Tier 1 is where things start to get interesting. Tier 1 is, the best decks of the format if there isn't sort of a definitive best deck. So these are the decks that are most likely going to win tournaments and will likely see the most play. Tier 2 decks are decks that, are not quite as good as tier 1, but they can still win a fair amount of games. So you'd expect maybe one or two of these decks to make it to the top 8 of a tournament if they're being played by very good players. Rogue decks are for the jank decks that, probably won't get much tournament success as they're not very good. They can't really compete even against the tier 2 decks. But when things go well for them, they go really well, and they can win games based off of that. And lastly, there's the trash tier. Decks that, basically have no chance of winning unless they basically win the lottery with their draws and their opponent's draws. So, now that we know the ranking system, let's dive in to some of these decks. And I'm generally going to go in order in this list, but before diving in to what appears to be the first deck here, Stall Mill, I feel like there is a deck that I have to talk about first, as it's so format defining, and that deck is Mask Control. Now, unsurprisingly, Mask Control is tier 1. It's one of the most popular decks in the format, and it's one of the reasons why the format is starting to gain popularity, as it's a very fun and skill-intensive deck to play. The deck basically uses Masked Sorcerer to draw cards, get advantage, and then be able to control the game from there. However, since there isn't really a concrete form of this outside of just playing Masked Sorcerers in some capacity and playing control cards, there are a lot of other decks on this list that also feel like Masked Control decks, as they're playing Masked Sorcerer as well. They just might have a bit more of a janky way to go about it. Given this, I wanted to discuss the core deck right away, just to clear up any confusion in the future. And I do think that this is tier 1, as being able to get this card advantage and capitalize on it is extremely good, and Mask Control does this like no other deck in the format. One other deck that I want to cover right away, because it shares similarities to Mask Control in how other decks use it in the format, is Hand Control. Now, Hand Control, like Mask Control, also seeks to sort of play the card advantage game, but instead of gaining card advantage, you're depriving your opponent of card advantage. Now, often this deck will play Masked Sorcerers as well to sort of capitalize on card advantage when your opponent is out of cards in hand. But in general, it's just going all in on discard cards like Robin Goblin and White Magical Hat. A lot of other decks in this format also want to use some of these cards, but just not to the same sort of devoted degree that a pure hand control deck will. So that's why I wanted to mention this now, just like Mask Control. And unlike Mask Control, I think that this deck is firmly in tier 2. Now, the reason I think this is because depriving your opponent of cards is very nice, but when they run out of cards in hand, the deck doesn't really do much. It's also very much a sort of like win more strategy, as Robin Goblin and White Magical Hat need your opponent to already have a field open for you to attack into. and this isn't always easy to do. When you're in a losing position and you draw Robin Goblin, it feels really bad because you can't really use it to protect yourself at all. Now, these decks can have ways to mitigate this, maybe playing defenders that can be difficult for your opponent out, but in general, they just aren't quite as consistent as Mass Control. They need a little bit more to go right for them than Mass Control generally does, and that's why I'm putting them in tier 2. But now that I've covered two major sort of like blanket strategies in the format that a lot of other decks do adapt, let's dive into the more specific strategies and talk about how they fare. Now, starting off strong with Stall Mill. Stall Mill was an easy tier 1 deck in Yu-Gi Kaiba format. So, where do you think it falls in Critter? That's right, trash tier. I made a video on Stall Mill, and to be fair, it wasn't a version of the Bistro Stall Mill deck, but I think that Bistro Mill is even worse than just typical Stall Mill. The deck has a lot of problems in Critter format. In Yu-Gi Kaiba, it was able to rely on its ultimate offerings to bring out 2K defenders that were really hard to get rid of in that format. In Critter, there are both ways to deal with ultimate offering and ways to deal with 2K defenders. Muka Muka is a great card that you can just bring out in a stall matchup when your hand is filled with cards that automatically beats over 2K defenders. If you're not playing Muka Muka, there's Jurai Gumo. And oftentimes you don't even need to attack for game. You can just bring out a Cannon Soldier and start burning your opponent to death. The deck just doesn't do enough in this format, even if it does gain some tools like Magician of Faith, which can loop back the card destructions, and some counter traps to stop your opponent's big plays. However, these counter traps are also likely to be present in your opponent's deck, and if your opponent can just counter a card destruction, then you kind of lose your Stall Mill edge. So there are just so many things leveled against this deck in this format that I just don't think it's even rogue. I think it's trash tier, which is surprising to say given how dominant it was in Yu-Gi Kaiba. But an influx of a lot of new cards really does change the way the meta shapes up, and we might see that again later on in this tier list. But before we get to that, we've got Catapult Turtle OTK. Now, Catapult Turtle OTK is a really neat deck. It aims to whittle down the opponent's life points a bit with big beaters, and then set up a big damage turn using Ultimate Offering and Catapult Turtle to burn your opponent to death after you get in a lot of damage by attacking. The deck also can use counter traps like Solemn Judgment or 7 Tools of the Bandit to clear the way for his big OTK push, and is in general just a very fun deck. Now, where do I think it lies in the tier list? This is a bit of a tricky one, as the deck can be very good when it pops off, but if you don't draw the right pieces, it can be pretty tough. I think after playing it a little bit, I want to put it in tier 2. I think Ultimate Offering is a very interesting card in this format that can enable major OTKs, even though Heavy is in the format and can deal with it. If you bide your time with the card and flip it up when you need to go for the big push, then it can be incredibly good. And this deck can just kill out of nowhere, especially if your opponent's relying on their Wabokus to keep them safe and you have counter traps for it. This deck is just very, very scary. And I think with a little bit more tinkering, it could see more consistent competitive play. It also did actually make it to the top 8 of a previous Critter tournament, so I'll take that into account as well. For now, I think the deck is tier 2. Maybe in the future we'll drop down to Rogue or rise to tier 1. Who knows? But I hope people keep experimenting with it. Next up, we've got Clown Control. Where do I think Clown Control goes? Clown Control is a deck that has been talked about a lot in a lot of these old formats. Basically, you're using Crass Clown and Dream Clown to control the board a bit and bounce cards back to hand with Crass Clown, destroy them with Dream Clown, and then hopefully capitalize on the empty board state with things like Robin Goblin or Mass Sorcerer. Control decks in this format are generally pretty good, as this is more of a control-oriented format. So, where do I think Clown Control lies? Well, it's definitely not tier 1 or 2, I can tell you that much. I may have won my game with Clown Control, but I don't think the deck is very good. But is it rogue or is it trash? This is a bit of an interesting one. I think I'm actually going to put it at top of trash tier. And my reasoning for this is that I may have won a game with it, but I largely won because I sided out of the Clown Control aspects of it in games 2 and 3. I think Crash Cloud and Dream Cloud are very interesting cards, but there just frankly aren't that many ways to protect them in this format as I'd like to play a deck built around them. I also think Dream Clown is really, really bad in this format. It just costs too many turns to use and too much to protect it. And I think the Crash Clown mainly wins on the merits of being slotted in a shell of a much better deck. And all that's why I'm putting it in trash tier. I think maybe in the future it could rise to Rogue, but that's a big maybe. And I think in general the deck just isn't good despite how much it is discussed. Next up we have Exodia. Now Exodia in Yu-Gi Kaiba had fallen a bit from its past heights in things like LOB format, which I know nobody plays, but it was, I think, the best deck in that format. So where do I think it lies in Critter format? Well, I think it actually is tier 1. The deck has won a tournament, and even in the last tournament, 2 people on Exodia made it to Top Cut. I think last tournament did show that decks are adapting to the threat of Exodia, so this could definitely fall in the future down to tier 2 or lower. But I think as decks start to adapt to Exodia, Exodia might start to adapt to them, and so who knows what this deck is going to do in the future. As of now, I do think that it is tier 1. It is a major meta deck that you have to watch out for and prepare for if you are going to play this format somewhat competitively. We'll see if Exodia falls to tier 2 or lower in the future though. Now we get to some decks that I haven't actually covered in my videos because they are so incredibly bad that I think the videos would actually be pretty boring. First is Gate Guardian. Gate Guardian is a big monster, 3750 attack, that you can bring out by tributing off 3 2-tribute monsters on your side of the field. And frankly, that's just a bit too much to ask in order to actually bring out your boss monster. So I'm going to put it in trash tier. I think that you're very likely not to be able to summon Gate Guardian, and I think that honestly you're unlikely to be able to summon out any of the pieces of it as well, like Kazujin, Suijin, or Song of the Thunder. So the deck is just generally not good. Speaking of not good decks, we've also got Great Moth. Great Moth is a deck that attempts to bring out the Great Moth, which is a 2600 attack monster that you can bring out after having equipped Petite Moth, which is a very weak monster, with a Cocoon of Evolution for 4 turns. And given that Heavy is at 2 in this format, and there's tons of monster removal around, I think that this is very unlikely to succeed. I'm going to put it in trash tier below Gate Guardian, because I think that while both decks are very unlikely to pull off their major win condition to bring out a boss monster, at least Gate Guardian has some decent intermediate bosses to get to. Great Moth relies on you having a very weak monster on the field for a very long time. And I think that the deck just cannot win outside of if it miraculously brings out a Great Moth. And even then, it's a bit iffy. Moving on to a deck that you'd think would be in a similar class as Great Moth and Gate Guardian, but actually is surprisingly good. We've got Harpies. Now, Harpies is a really neat deck in this format. It basically is kind of an OTK deck. You know, you're just bringing out Harpy Lady Sisters with Elegant Egotist to get in a major damage push, and then potentially even tribute off your monster with a Cannon Soldier to get in that last bit of damage. This deck really surprised me when I was playing it. I think that it is something that people should really experiment with more, as it's very fun and can be very explosive. However, do I think that this makes it tier 2 or even tier 1? Not really. I think that it's in Rogue. I think that it could potentially rise higher in the future. But given that you have to play Harpy Lady Sisters in the deck, which is a useless card if you draw it, and you have to also play Harpy Ladies, which don't really do much on their own, I think that the deck is firmly Rogue, but with potential to rise in the future, and also very fun. Moving on, we've got another nebulous sort of deck category, which I call Beatdown. Now, this is a bit of a nebulous deck strategy and could be clumped in with other deck strategies like Cannon Burn, which I'll discuss later. But basically, I'm defining this variant of Beatdown as a deck that's relying more on the Gumos and like Muka Mukas and just 1800 beaters to get in damage than like burn cards to finish off your opponent. So I think that this deck is very underexplored, potentially one of the most underexplored strategies in Critter format. And I think that if people experiment with it more, it could potentially have the chance to rise to even tier 1. I think right now, though, it's firmly in tier 2. Maybe above Catapult Turtle OTK. Maybe. I think I'm going to put it above Catapult Turtle OTK, as I do think that the deck relies on less combo pieces to just beat the opponent in. But I think that this deck has a lot of potential, and I hope that people experiment with it in the future to unlock that potential. In a slower control format like this, just pressuring your opponent with a constant deluge of big beaters can be really huge. Moving on from the very good, we've got Dragons, which I would not call very good. It did get some tools for this format, like ways to search out Lord of D, but I think Dragon still lies firmly in Rogue, and I'm going to put it under Harpies as it needs a bit more to go right for it than Harpies does. It's also sort of a big explosive OTK deck, which relies on Lord of D and Flute Summoning Dragon to bring out a bunch of big dragons from your hand. But the dragons and the flutes are unsearchable, and this is a 3-card combo. And there are just so many traps in this format that can put a stop to it. Yes, you can play 7 tools to sort of mitigate that, but, sometimes you just gotta go for the combo when you don't have all the pieces on field to guarantee it. And that can be really rough for you. So while the deck can win if it manages to pull off its combo, if it doesn't, it's kind of dead in the water, and that's why I'm putting it in Rogue. Moving on, we've got Flip Control, which is also a pretty nebulous deck type. As I said in my Flip Control video, I view this more of a style of play than a particular strategy in itself, but I figured I'd include it in the tier list because I did make a video covering it. I think that the deck, while being able to control the board decently well, has a lot of trouble pushing through to actually win the game. And so I think it's kind of iffy where I place this. It's just a deck that relies on a bunch of flip monsters, which a lot of other better decks do. But I think if you actually include good cards into it, it just becomes a variant of like Mass Control or something else. So I'm actually going to put it at top of Rogue. And this may seem really weird given it is a control format, and control decks are generally good, but because it's a control format, this deck feels especially underwhelming. I think in the future, if people experiment with this more, it could rise in the rankings a little bit. But as is, going all in on Flip Control, I think is just watering down better control decks. And also, if you are forced to Maneater Bug a Recruiter, it feels super, super bad. So I'll put it in Rogue with the proviso that it very easily could rise to tier 2 or maybe even higher in the future. Next up, we've got a deck very similar to Flip Control. We've got Mask Negate. Now this deck aims to leverage Mask of Darkness to repeatedly add counter traps to hand and basically put a stop to whatever your opponent wants to do. Where do I put this deck given that I put Flip Control in Rogue? Well, I actually think that this deck is quite a bit better than Flip Control, as it is using a flip monster, but it's mainly relying on counter traps to shut down the game. And for that reason, I'm actually going to put it at the bottom of tier 2. Counter traps are some of this format's most powerful cards, and if you're playing more of them, like Magic Jammer or 7 Tools, in addition to the Solemns, it can make your deck very hard for certain decks to deal with. And if you're able to recycle those repeatedly, then it makes the deck even more tough to deal with. So I really like this deck. I think with more experimentation, it could maybe rise. Right now, I'm going to put it in tier 2. I think also with more experimentation, it could definitely fall. I did play some good games with this. Maybe I just got lucky. Maybe it does belong in Rogue, but I like it in tier 2. Next up, we've got Pumpking, and this is an easy trash for me. Do I put it above or below Stallmill? I'll put it above Stallmill. Now, I did manage to win the games that I did play with Pumpking, but I just think that was incredibly lucky. I was playing them on Halloween, so the spirit of Halloween flowed through me and enabled me to pull that off. I think that Pumpking in general is a terrible deck and should not really see any more experimentation. It's really bad. Do I ever think this deck will rise to Rogue or above? No. It's just super, super bad. Don't play it. Moving on, we've got Soul Control. Now, just like Stallmill, Soul Control was one of the premier decks of Yu-Gi Kaiba format. So how good is it in Critter? Well, it's really bad. I think it's actually trashed here. And the reason for this is that, you can't give up your battle phase in a format like this. I know that sounds pretty weird to say in a control format, but honestly, things like mass control can control the field a lot better while also being able to get in for damage and gain card advantage at the same time. Giving up your battle phase just passes it to your opponent to just do something about your monster, and in this format, they very easily can. In addition, unlike in Yugi Kaiba, where there weren't really many ways to get over an opponent's lodge-in or 2K defender, in Critter there are a bunch that regularly see play in a lot of the top decks. So I think that even though Soul Control did get some tools in the form of Thunder Dragons and Cannon Soldiers and even Share the Pain, I think the deck is firmly in trash tier. Maybe with more experimentation in the future it will rise, but don't be fooled by how good it is in Yugi Kaiba. It is not very good in Critter. Next up, we've got Aggro Burn or Cannon Burn. And I think this deck is at a very similar point to Beatdown. I think pure Beatdown's a little bit better as the burn spells can clog up your hand a little bit, but being able to play that extra bit of oomph at the end of the game with a tremendous fire or a cannon soldier killing your opponent out of nowhere is a very, very cool thing to do. So I think maybe this goes in tier 2, right around where Beatdown is. They're very, very similar decks. Honestly, you could just lump them together as the same deck, but I like to separate them out a little bit, as my experiences with going the more burn direction on Cannon Burn were not the best, whereas my experiments with just playing a pure Beatdown deck were a lot better. So I like to view them as different decks, and I like to think that Beatdown is a little bit better. Maybe this will change as people experiment with this more, and maybe it could even rise up to tier 1 or fall to Rogue, I've said that about a lot of decks, but I think it is really true. The format is very underexplored, and there could be massive changes to this tier list in the future. Lastly, we have Fusion, and I'm counting this Fusion deck as the sort of Thunder Dragon Fusion deck that I showed off on my channel a while back. I think this deck is pretty good. You basically use it in conjunction with things like Muka Muka to bide your time and whittle your opponent down for a while to then make a major late game twin-headed Thunder Dragon play after your opponent's hopefully exhausted a lot of removal on your other threats. I think this deck is pretty good. I'm going to put it at top of Rogue, actually. This might be because the janker elements of it are not really as played in the main deck. All you really have to commit to in the main deck is one copy of Polymerization, and then your twin-headed Thunder Dragons can just reside in your Fusion deck, so it doesn't take up as much deck space, and I think it is actually a really cool late game push that can be very difficult for your opponent to deal with or to take into account. So I hope that more people experiment with Fusion in the future, as I think it's got some decent legs. There are janker versions of the Fusion deck that you can play that would probably reside in trash tier or the bottom of Rogue, but I think that the twin-headed Thunder Dragon version definitely is in the top of the category. And that's going to be my version of the Critter tier list for December 2022. As I said, this could easily change in the future. It looks like there may be another Critter tournament on the horizon, so I'll let you all know the details of that when I know the details of that, and that could easily change this ranking drastically. But for now, with the current meta as it is, I think that this is the tier list for the format. But let me know down in the comments below if you disagree, or if I left off any deck on this list that you were looking forward to. I think I got them all. I at least got all the ones that I covered in my videos, but I could have easily left some out. So let me know down in the comments below if I did. Also, let me know if you have any surprising takeaways from this. Like, I personally am very, very shocked that both of the best decks in last format, Soul Control and Stall Mill, actually fell down all the way to trash tier in Critter format. It's just such a big upheaval, and it's why I'm sort of exploring these old formats sequentially, because it's cool to see when decks that were initially at the top of the heap have a major fall as newer, more powerful decks replace them. But I hope you enjoyed this video as always. And until next time, I've been Ben from White Show from Zero, and I'm signing off.